Welcome. I think we're going to get started. Welcome to session TA8900-vSphere Administration for the Average Admin. Thank you for coming today during your lunchtime, and hopefully we'll make it worth your while. My name is Tony Ganser. I'm a solutions consultant with a company called NWN, and we're a national company. I'm located in the West Office, which is out of Sacramento. And a little bit about me. Presented at VMware last year, did a session similar to this, and also one on Tuesday. Did anybody attend the session last year? I had a couple people on Tuesday's session. So certified in the usual suspects, Microsoft, VMware, Cisco, Citrix, blah, blah, blah. Like I said, solutions consultant, which means I'm actually like you guys. I do work, right? I'm not pre-sales. I go out and help people. So they'll call when they have problems or they need to do design. So I'm actually a field guy. I'm not a presenter by trade, and this is not something I'm really comfortable. So please excuse me if I make any presentation mistakes. Today is Thursday, so we're presenting at noon. And like I said, I don't do this often, so I really value the evaluations. So I want to make sure that the content that I'm providing you guys is helpful. It's going to actually help you in your jobs. If you have any recommendations, I'm going to update a couple things based on Tuesday's session, but anything that I might miss, evaluations on presentation, what you'd like to see more of, very useful information for me going forward. There's lots of information that I couldn't cram into these slides, right? There's only so many words you can put on a slide deck. So when you download the presentation, there's a ton of text in the notes section of this presentation. So I know a lot of people in the Tuesday session were taking a lot of notes, and they're feverishly trying to catch up because I go through a lot of content. I'm going to really clip through these things. So if you get a chance, download the presentation. There's lots of stuff in the notes section, and I'll refer to that throughout the presentation today. So here's our life. We're an average admin. What I meant by that is not that we're average in our jobs. It's just that we're not at huge companies, right? So if I'm a Google and I have a problem with my file server or I have a problem with my file system, what I go to a team, and they develop a whole new file system. GFS is born, right? So as a normal average admin, I don't have those kind of resources available to me. I don't have a team of developers. It's just me and a small team of guys, and we're just trying to keep our heads above water. So kind of the purpose of this presentation is give you guys what I've seen in the field, kind of tips and tricks that I use, and best practices so that you can go back and implement them. Because this is our job. We come in and we have all these things, so it's like, what am I going to work on today? I have all these new projects I got to get done. Management's always getting me new projects. I got to make sure and keep my servers patched. I got to deploy hundreds of VMs or tens. There's always VM requests every morning when I come in. What's my storage look like? I want to make sure I'm not running out. Event logs, right? I need to make sure there's no big fires burning that I need to take care of. So we have all these tasks that we got to do as administrators, and we have to manage our time. So how do I get all these tasks done? So hopefully we're going to help you achieve that goal and make you more efficient. So anything that I present today, please take back and test in your guys' own environments, because while I do use all these techniques all the time, every deployment is different, right? So every place is unique. So session at a glance, we're going to go over some design fundamentals because I see a lot of issues when I go out that there's really maybe not a design at all. People haven't done any documentation, so we're going to talk a little bit about that. We're going to talk about what you need to do to create a good, efficient virtual world. And then finally, we're going to wrap up and talk about how I'm going to manage that. I've done all this foundational work. I've done the design. We're really in it. We've got hundreds of VMs. How do I manage it all? I'm going to wrap up with a couple final thoughts, and then hopefully we'll have some time for Q&A. So let's get started. So this is the foundational elements that I've called. There's more, but these are kind of the core tenets of our design, right, for virtualization. We have the platform, which is going to be ESX or ESXi, vCenter. We want to make sure that our security is built into our design, that our network design is done, and that our storage is really solid. And all of these elements kind of form just the foundational infrastructure. And then on top of this infrastructure is what we actually run our VMs on. So here's another way to explain that. And I use this. It's a terrible graphic. I wish I could have had time to do it Visio. But the idea is that there's lots of steps that you have to take to get to where you're actually deploying templates, deploying operating system, and deploying applications in those, right? You have to make sure that you have all of these things in place and before you can actually start deploying your VMs. So this is also, this slide's not really useful for when you're building up, but a lot of times it's something that's forgot when you're looking at DR plans, right? So I've got storage replicating, I've got ESX hosting other sites, but maybe I haven't thought about Active Directory or DNS. How's that going to be affected? Do I have an IP plan in my DR site or my other site? So it's just a quick little a little graphic so that you can really see what really goes into getting to the top of the pyramid. So a couple of design tips. Have a design in place before installation. It's really important that we think about how our environment is going to form. We really put time and effort into following best practices and making sure that we have a process that we can follow. All of our servers are configured identically, because a lot of times when we have problems, it's because we didn't follow a process. And then what other designs are you thinking about? Do you have a backup and DR design? What's the requirements of that backup and DR design? Do you need to do full VMDK? Do you want to be able to do full VMDK restores? Are we trying to go to another DR offsite? What are those questions? Try to get those things answered. Naming conventions is something it's something that's so fundamental that it really needs to happen, but I don't see a lot of times when I go out to sites. So they'll have a server naming convention, but maybe they don't have a port group naming convention, a vSwitch naming convention. And the one that gets me the most is they don't have a data store naming convention. So you'll go out to a site and they'll have 100 LUNs and they're labeled LUN 1 through 100. So what does that tell me about the LUN? Nothing. It doesn't tell me if it's fiber channel, NFS, iSCSI, are the disks 10K, SATA, 15K. Right? These are really important questions that you need to answer before you deploy VMs, because not all VMs are created equal. You might have development VMs, you might have production VMs, high workload VMs. So you want to make sure that your naming convention is useful to you so that when you are doing deployments, you know where to put those VMs and where they should live. So that's one that I really think a lot of people need to come up to speed and make sure they have one. So network design is kind of the usual suspect. Everybody knows about VLANs, IP addresses. But firewalls, I see more virtualization in DMZs now. Are you really taking into account, have you really documented what the port flows are so that you know that it will work in a DMZ or firewalled off area? And then storage. Storage is just a critical, and I'll go into this more in a minute, but making sure that you know what your connectivity is. You want to have the design in place, again, before you kind of get started. Have a plan. Do you know what your data store, your target data store size is? How many VMs are you targeting per data store? You don't want to have 100 per data store because you probably don't have the IOPS to drive that many. But maybe you want to have 10, 15, 20. There are some best practices out there, but it's going to depend on your vendor and what you're trying to achieve. Are you using space-saving technologies like deduplication or thin provisioning? Because if you are using deduplication, that means you want to try and group light VMs together, because you're going to get more mileage out of that technology. So again, having this design and knowing how to implement it is going to make you more efficient. And of course, you really want to get to operational efficiencies. That's really where we're headed. So make sure that you have this monitoring and reporting in place, because you want alerts and problems to come to you before people are bringing them to you, right? So I want to get stuff in my email that I have a report that says this data store is filling up, you need to fix it, or this VM is running out of space. So Scott Drummond is performance. He used to work at VMware. He's at EMC now, but he's doing a couple of sessions on performance, and he always says storage is the number one reason for performance problems in virtualization. Memory is number 2, but storage is always number 1. And it's because customers don't have a good enough understanding of storage, and they're not sizing their stuff appropriately. So this is something that we really need to focus on and make sure that we're getting it right, because instability in your storage environment is not acceptable. If you have issues with your storage and you can't get to it all the time, not only are you affecting your virtualization environment, but a lot of times your other applications like SQL clusters or Oracle RAC, they're relying on that same storage infrastructure to work. So storage problem is really more than just your virtual environment. It's really can affect your whole data center. So data loss is also, it's completely unacceptable. If you're having any of these problems with your vendors, you really need to kind of work these things out, because us as technologists, our business is data. Everything that we do, it resolves around that data. So if we're losing that data, then we're really failing as technologists, because we build these web apps to present that data in a different way. We build resources to data mine it, to do reporting. So data is our lifeblood. And then don't trust the storage vendors. And what I mean by this is a lot of storage vendors, almost all of them, will tell you they have some form of non-disruptive upgrade paths for doing firmware updates, right? And more often than not, you'll go to actually perform what they tell you to do, and it's an actual disruptive thing. So the reason why I say think used car salesman, there's another reason is if you go to a lot and you drive a car off the lot and you have problems with it, how easy is it to take it back, right? It's nearly impossible. So think about it from a storage standpoint. You spend, hundreds of thousands of dollars potentially on this storage environment. You get trained on it. You put it in. You have problems with it. What's the likelihood that you're just going to be like, hey, come pick this thing up and give me a refund, right? It's not going to happen. So really thinking through your processes and getting your storage right is a huge thing that it's a huge win in your design. And finally, I have a lot more tips in the notes section, but this is a real kind of a no-brainer one. I'll go out to sites and I'll see that they've got a 500 gig LUN and they've got 200 meg of free space in that LUN. They're just pushing the limits as much as possible. And that's an immediate red flag for me, because I'll say, do you understand that you're really going to run out of space here? Well, what do you mean? I've thick provisioned all my VMDKs. So why can't I fill it up to the maximum? Well, do you use snapshots? Yes, I do. Well, snapshots don't get incorporated into that VMDK. That's a wholly separate VMDK, so as soon as you do that. Another one that gets people is memory size. If you bumped your memory from 2 gigs to 4 gigs, the swap file is going to go up in 2 gigs. So you don't even have enough space to even increase the memory on your VMs. So as a general rule of thumb, you want to leave at least 20% of free space on your data stores. And this is also, from a storage vendor perspective, from storage, they'll typically tell you that to optimize performance, you need to leave free space to go do the maintenance processes and things like that. So this is also a great reason to use thin provisioning. And what I tell people is thin provisioning, is not a technology to cram more VMs onto a data store. What thin provisioning can give you is this kind of headroom, this free space that you can use so that you can do snapshots on the data store. You don't have to worry about filling up because you're doing a log file or your vSwap's getting bigger. So instead of saying, normally on this data store I can only run 5 or 7 VMs because it's taking up all this space, don't go, well, I can run 30 if I thin provision. Think about it as maybe I can run 10 or 15, but instead of having very little free space, maybe tens of gigs, I could have hundreds of gigs, and then I can really use snapshots and I can do some of these other things. So that's a great use of thin provisioning versus just trying to cram everything on, because if you try to cram everything onto a data store, most likely you're going to have some performance problems at the storage level. So moving on to a couple quick notes about processors. I've gone to shops where they were AMD for a long time, and then they decide, we're going to switch to Intel, or we're Intel and we're going to switch to AMD. And it sounds great in theory, but what happens is you lose a lot of flexibility because you cannot vMotion between these vendors right now, today. And I don't know if this is even going to happen anytime in the future. So what we've taken one of the primary tenets, or one of the benefits of virtualization out of the equation, which is flexibility. Virtualization is all about flexibility. So don't switch vendors unless you have a really good reason. If you're going to rebuild fresh or something of that nature, just try to stick with who you've got. And also, when this kind of statement, OpEx versus CapEx, right? So capital expenditures is saying this server costs $3,000 less than that server. The problem is your operations cost a lot more than your capital expenditure. So let's say that this server is $3,000 less, but that's another platform we've got to learn as engineers. That's more firmware that we've got to update that's different. So that means our processes have got to change. There's a big cost in moving to that just from an operations side that's probably going to dwarf your capital savings. So always think about operations versus capital expenditures. And then also, performance per thread matters. And why I say this is most of our VMs are deployed with, one vCPU, right? Maybe you even have 2 vCPUs. So that VM only has access to a core. So your performance per core matters. If you're running a benchmark on inside of a VM, and one's got 2 gigahertz of processing power, and another one's got 3 gigahertz of processing power, that benchmark's going to show a big difference in performance numbers. So having that performance per core per thread does matter. It's not because I have so many, 12 or 24 or 48 cores, whatever you've got. That is your overall environment, but to an individual VM, the per core processing power does have an impact. And then make sure you have BIOS settings that are set per your vendor, and we'll go over those in a few minutes. And next, I was going to talk a little bit about verifying licensing. With some of these new architectures, you're talking about 10, 12 cores per socket. And in the vSphere licensing, you need to take this into account. As you can see, depending on what you're licensed for, you may only be able to run 6 cores per socket. So if you were licensed with Enterprise Edition and you have a new MagniCore processor from AMD, you would actually take up 2 licenses per socket. So you're not really saving any money by cramming more cores in there, depending on what your VMware license is. So this is something that you need to be aware of when you're going to do your planning. So talk a little bit about optimizing memory. This is for ordering, because now with all these new architectures, it's kind of, we have DDR2, we have DDR3, now memory is per socket. So I just want to give you a couple of quick tips on these. So with the AMD MagniCore processors, it's a quad channel design. So what you want to do is you want to buy in groups of 8. So if you're using 4 gig DIMMs, that means you're going to buy 32 gig, 64 gig, 96 gigs. This is to optimize your performance with your memory. It doesn't mean you have to do that, but these are the most optimal ways to increase your memory size. And then on the Intel NUM or Westmere processors, the 55 and 5600s, they have a tri-channel design. So if you're, again, buying 4 gig memory sticks, you're going to buy in groups of 24. So it'd be 24, 48, 72. Those are the ones that you want. And then the X series is required to do 1333 megahertz bus speed. Again, this is to really optimize your memory. I just want to put that in there. And finally, this is a little article that's on AnandTech. I don't know if anybody read this, but it's about power savings. So all these vendors have low-power processors, and what they did was they did a comparison. If I took a power hog high-performance processor and I compared it against a low, energy-efficient processor, how much watts actually being used? And because the faster processors can actually shut down because they can get through the processes faster and actually turn off, they actually saw in their statistics that the higher energy hog CPUs actually save more power in the long run. So just an interesting article. It's in the notes section, or you can just go to AnandTech and check it out. So ESX, you've seen this, ESX, Go, ESX Info Center. There's a lot of links out here about ESXi. This is the last. 4.1 is the last version to support ESX. So you really got to start planning. If you're not already moving to ESXi, you got to really start doing it now. So this is not necessarily a bad thing because a lot of vendors have made this shift. They know that ESXi is coming, so they've really moved to APIs versus relying on the service console and agents. And it's really addressed a lot of the problems that a lot of people had, a lot of the issues that people had with ESX. Because now there is a console mode. The tech support command line is now officially supported. It's not a hack. And you can now boot from SAN, which is another feature that a lot of bigger departments like. So that's a feature that they now include. So in order to do that, look at the VMware sessions on the VMware appliance and really get familiar with that because that's going to be your bread and butter. So last year, I was saying that ESXi is the future and ESX is today because it was the safe mode. Now that's kind of flipped. ESX is the past and ESXi is today. So what's the benefit of ESXi? It's easy to install and patch. The patching is much more simpler than ESX, so you're going to really enjoy that if you haven't done it. It's less likely to break. You're not putting agents in there with memory leaks. You don't have a service console with all these security fixes that they've got to fix all the time. The vast majority of VMware patches weren't actually patches to the VMware product code. They are actually patches to the service console. So those are some of the pros. Here's some of the things that you want to verify before you move to the ESXi platform. You want to make sure that your hardware monitoring functionality is caught up. If you're on HP, you used to install HP SIM agents inside the console. Now they've got an add-on for ESXi. There's a link in the notes section that you can go out and download that. Make sure that your system management functionality, if you have a version control kind of repository, something like that had an agent, make sure that that still works. And then any kind of custom scripts that you used to do with Bash, right? You could just go into the shell and create a script. Try to verify that those scripts will still work through PowerCLI or something in the VMware appliance. So a few BIOS settings that I think that you guys should be aware of. You want to make sure to set date and time. Time is critical. It's a critical importance in the virtualization infrastructure. You want to make sure you get it right. No-brainer enable virtualization technology, and you would be shocked how many places I go to, and this is not enabled. Another one that some people kind of forget to look at or don't do is the execution disable bit or the AMD's no execute page protection. And this is a requirement for EVC, which is enhanced vMotion compatibility, and is also can be a requirement for 64-bit Linux operating systems. And then finally, there's some power management options that a lot of people are just becoming aware of, is that VMware supports Intel SpeedStep and AMD Power Now. So you've had on your laptops and everything for a long time that will clock down your CPUs. You can actually set this up on your servers and get some pretty decent power savings, 25% or so, depending on how busy your boxes are. And it's a pretty simple thing to do. You just enable the OS control in the BIOS and then set the option in advanced settings on your ESX settings. So a couple other best practices, setting your service console to 800 meg. That's been around for a long time. Although with 4.1 and 4.0, if you have enough memory in there, it'll do that for you automatically. Set the power management policy. It's power.cpu policy equals dynamic. It's in the advanced settings. There's instructions, and there's a link to TechHead that he walks you through the whole process and the kind of tests that he performed. Configure the user world swap file. That's for clustering for ESXi. Configure NTP. Make sure your time service is all good. If you're using NFS or iSCSI, make sure you set your TCP heap values or your NFS. There's a few NFS values that need to be set. That you can look at the NetApp best practices guide for that, or EMC's got a good document on that as well. The values are, again, in the notes section. You want to make sure you have the latest drivers. One of the good examples I can give of that is if you have a C7000 chassis and you're using FlexNix or you're using Virtual Connect, one of the technologies is called SmartLink, and that tells when the uplink is down, it actually tells the host that its also network connection is down. But if you don't update the driver and you don't update the firmware on the Broadcom driver, that won't not work. So make sure you have the latest drivers on stuff. So moving on to some vCenter tips. So we're going to talk about a few management tips. We're going to get to VM templates and then go over some cluster settings for best practices. So here's a great management tip that, again, for role-based authentication, we want to get to this role-based authentication so that when users log in, they have just the functionality that they need to do their job. So one of the great features in VMware is the roles. So what you want to do is create custom roles, and then you can add your Active Directory groups into those roles and just give your users the rights that they need. So they just need to power off or power off VMs, maybe take snapshots. You don't want them to obviously have admin rights. So this also gives you some auditing trail. And then folders is a great tool to do security separation, right? So you can create folders, and I'll show you an example right here about how there's a folder hierarchy. And what I've done is I've gone in and assigned departments into a folder so that I can have different groups. And so I have different roles. So you can see there's a VM user, so they can only maybe take snapshots, remove snapshots, power on VMs. I'll have like a read-only account for kind of monitoring services. So I've kind of divided things up and only let them do the things that they need to do. So you can also use folder-based for alarms. So you have an Exchange team that's separate from your file services team or something of that nature. What you can do is use your folders so that they only get the alarms that apply to their VM. So they're not getting everything, so they're not getting overwhelmed with alerts, but they get stuff that they're interested in. And this is one of my favorite features that nobody uses. It's called a custom attribute. What you can see is in the summary tab of a VM, you can actually put your own custom information in there. And so what I always use this for is this is a poor man's billing. Because what I can create, if I don't have money for chargeback or something like that, what I can do is I can create categories that I can add information in that's on a per VM basis. So I can put a distribution list. So I know as a VM administrator, I've got hundreds of VMs, and maybe I have a problem with one, and I want to alert the people that are having that issue. So I can put a distribution list in for that. If there's a specific department that this VM belongs to for reporting, then I can put those things in there. IOs, is it production, is it development? There's a lot, any category that you can think of. And what you can do is I'm going to show you a tool later that you can pull that information out of and just create a really simple report. So here are some of the cluster settings to talk about. ESXi and ESX don't mix. It's really hard to get these to work into a cluster. So you want to separate your ESXi clusters from your ESX clusters. Use fully qualified domain names and make sure your DNS is accurate. Don't use IP addresses. Use a secondary service console and isolation address. So what this means is that most service consoles are kind of on a separate management network. And what can happen is that management network can fail, but your VM network can work just fine. So in those instances, you wouldn't want your isolation response to be power off because your VMs are functioning correctly. It's just that the service console network went berserk. So what you can do is you create a secondary service console and a secondary isolation address. And that way it can be, if it's for storage, if you're using IP-based storage, a great IP to ping would be the storage IP on your storage appliance. So that if your storage is down, your VMs are down. So that's just something to take into consideration to help eliminate false positives for isolation. And then decide on your isolation response and test it so the two are leave powered on or power off. If you're performing all the best practices, you have your secondary isolation address set and it's functioning, then we would kind of recommend that you power off because you really want your environment functioning as clean as possible. And then review the advanced settings. I put a link in here to Ducking Eppins, the yellow-bricks.com. He's got a great page on HA settings. Goes through all the advanced settings and which ones that you guys want to use. And then in large environments, especially if you have blade chassis, you want to make sure that you're separating your physical and secondary nodes. And what this can be is, let's say you had two blade chassis and you want redundancy, so you put one blade chassis in one rack and another blade chassis in the other rack. But then when you do the installs, you install your first 5 hosts in one rack, and then you install 6 through 10 in the other rack. What can happen is, by default, the first 5 hosts added to the cluster are your primary nodes. So let's say that you're talking to your CIO, and you're like, yeah, we have all this redundancy. If we lose this chassis, this rack, they're just going to get powered up on this other chassis. Well, that may not be the case because all your primary nodes are in one chassis, and you don't have any primary nodes in the other chassis to actually perform the power-ons. So that's something to look at if you're in these bigger environments. Where are your nodes at? And make sure to go through and configure your VM restart priorities. You want to make sure that you have your infrastructure components up first before you bring up your application servers. So make sure your Active Directory, your DNS, your SQL server for your virtual center server, all those things need to be in place before you can actually go and start powering on your application VMs. So you want to go through and configure those restart priorities. Okay, so we've talked about some design. Now we're going to really move into how we're going to create our virtual world. How are we going to get VMs running on this? So we're going to talk about, again, OS template designs, P2V tips, and some LUN alignment. So what is LUN alignment? There's been a lot of misconception, or people just don't even know what it is. So what LUN alignment is really you have three different file systems when you're talking block-based storage. So that would be iSCSI or Fiber Channel. You have your Windows or Linux operating system, so NTFS, FAT, or ext3 running on top of a VMFS file system that's, again, running on top of a SAN file system of some sort, right? So what can happen is if these three layers are not actually lined up, what can happen is one read or write request can actually result in three read or write requests to your storage. So you really are tripling the amount of work that your storage needs to do because you haven't done some of the processes to LUN align your VMs. So a LUN aligned VM will have clean delimitation so that any one read or write operation to a cluster on your VMDK, so this is your actual VM, and this is your VMFS data store that you're running on top of, always results in just one read or write to your SAN chunk. And Chad Sakich from EMC and Duncan have done a post on this as well, and Chad said that depending on your platform for EMC, this can result in up to a 30% performance hit. So on the Clarion, the Symmetrics, because of the chunking and the way that it does, it has much bigger stripes. It doesn't have quite the impact, but this can have a big performance hit for your storage. It just means it's doing a lot more work than it should have to do. So some alignment things that you need to know. Windows 2000, Vista, and 7 are automatically LUN aligned by default. Microsoft changed the starting offset value, so if you're running those VMs, you don't have to worry about it. Windows XP 2000 and Linux do need to be LUN aligned, however. So I know a lot of people haven't made this transition to 2008, and you're still running 2003 VMs. So you really want to get your VM templates LUN aligned, because if you LUN align your VM template, then you don't have to worry about all the hosts that you deploy off of that template. So you want to LUN align the partition before you install the OS. So what I typically do is I'll attach my template VMDK before I've installed anything to it to an existing running VM, a Windows box. I'll do a disk part and LUN align it, and then I'll install the operating system on top of it. So the tools that you're going to use are a disk part for Windows, and for Linux you can use gparted. I'm not a Linux expert, so I'm sure there's lots of other tools, but that's the one that I've used. Okay, so now we're going to get into template design. So templates form really a very, very big foundational element for our virtual environment. If we get our templates right, then we're going to have really good success with our virtual machines. If we get them wrong, that means we've got hundreds of virtual machines running around that are flawed. So they're extremely important to get correct. So what I'd like to see when I go out is, what's your process? Do you have a process or a checklist to create your templates? You know that I've followed this process, I've got all my security hardening down, I've LUN aligned my VMs, and I know to stop these services and set these parameters, right? You really want to have that dialed in because this is a huge element. Make sure to LUN align your templates, because if you LUN align those, then you don't have to worry about all your other ones. And this comes back to the LUN aligning of the templates. You don't want to delete your partition when you're installing the operating system. So you've gone through the effort to LUN align that partition. If you tell the installer to go ahead and wipe that partition and create a new one, you've just undone all of your work. And then understanding OS requirements is critical. And what I mean by this is, if you're just a VMware admin and you don't really know Windows that well, you're not going to design a very good Windows template, are you? And it's the same with Linux. A lot of us come from the kind of the Windows background, I'm guessing. And we have Linux appliances. We're getting a lot more of those in. So it's important to try to find somebody, do the research, and make sure that you get that right. So now we're going to break off and talk specifically about the two different types of templates and what we do with them. So again, we use gparted to pre-LUN the line disks. We don't use LVM because Logical Volume Manager tends to just, again, like Windows installer, will just wipe it out and you won't have a LUN aligned volume. I do want to mention there are a couple free tools that you can use. NetApp has MBR Align and MBR Scan that you can use to check if your templates or if your VMDKs are LUN aligned. That's for free. You can go find that. So there are tools out there that you can use for LUN alignment. Make sure to configure NTP. Linux has unnecessary services just like Windows does. Make sure to disable those. And then I have this tip, and nobody's corrected me yet, so I don't know if it's still accurate. But I've been told that when doing Linux boxes, you want to install with 2 vCPUs to get the appropriate HAL, then go back and dumb it down to 1. So on the Windows side, again, for 2003, you want to use the appropriate HAL. It's going to be the uniprocessor for 1 or multiprocessor ACPI for multiples. For Windows 2008, it's not much of an issue. You want to use integrated service packs, and on my session on Tuesday, somebody asked, what's an integrated service pack? So good question. What I meant by that is if you go to Microsoft's site, you can see you'll download an ISO image. It'll say Windows 2003 with Service Pack 2. What that means is Service Pack 2 is already integrated into the base install, as opposed to having Windows 2003 disk and downloading Service Pack 2 and installing it on top of that. And the reason why I say to use integrated service packs, not just to save you some time, it's going to save you a bunch of space. Because if you have a service pack that you're putting on there that's 300 meg, and you're going to double that because you're going to integrate it in the operating system, that's 600 meg per VM. If you've got 100 VMs, you just wasted, 60 gig or something like that. So you can actually waste a lot of space by not using integrated service packs. So whenever a major service pack is released, I actually go through and recreate all my templates. So there's another reason to have a checklist and a process in place so I can do that quickly. There's a tool called Nlight that you can use, the slipstream. That's the old technology where you couldn't have integrated service packs, so you can use Nlight to slipstream that service pack into your installations. Be careful with that line. Okay. And Microsoft's got KB article on how to do it from the command line too, which is the way I've always done it. So for licensing, again, we want to get our templates right. So I tried to have as few templates as possible. A lot of people are licensing virtualization with Data Center Edition, which means I paper licensed 2 sockets if you have a dual socket box with Data Center Edition, which means I can really run any previous or lower step version of the operating system. So why would I want to have a Standard Edition and Enterprise Edition? Why would I want to have templates for each of those operating systems? There's really no value of that. As you go, Enterprise Edition gives you features like for 32-bit 2003, you can run more than 4 gig of memory. And for 2008, you can hot add memory. So running the bigger editions, if you will, of the operating system is going to save you a little bit more time. And if that's fewer templates that you have to manage, that's a bonus to you. So look at what your licensing is and see if you can shrink the number of templates that you have to manage. So again, this is not the same, but do not use partitions, only use disks. And what I mean by that is it's really 1 partition per disk. And the reason is, back in the old days when we had RAID controllers, we'd have 1 giant LUN, we would carve it up, right? We'd have 20 gig for C, we'd have 3 or 5 gigs for page, and then the rest would be data. What that prevents us from doing, though, is we can't extend anything. We can't use disk part to extend the system or page disk. We can only extend the last partition. So we don't need to be in this bottleneck with VMware. We can just create more VMDK files. So what you want to be able to do is, with 2008, you can extend any drive at any time. So C drive's running out of space, go into VM settings, make it from 20 gigs, make it 10 gigs, run disk part, extend. You just added 10 gigs of space to that VM with no downtime. So if you create 1 partition per disk, you have all this flexibility. And again, with Windows, you want to stop and disable all unnecessary services. I like to move my page file to its own disk. And the reason for that is, maybe I don't want to back up my page file because I don't really need it. Maybe I don't want to replicate it to my DR site. Maybe I want to put it on slower storage because I never page because I have lots of memory. So by having it on its own disk, you just have more flexibility and more options. Using multiple SCSI adapters can help performance on the storage side because it can issue more commands. And I was in the VDR lab downstairs. Hopefully you guys got some time to get in there because they are a lot of great labs. But one of the recommendations at the end is that the SCSI adapter for your data store be different than the SCSI adapter for the VDR OS. So that's just an example of the people actually implementing that kind of recommendation. So make sure to enable the VSS driver if you want to quiesce your VMs. So I put update 2+, and that's for 3.5. So it's only supported in 3.5, update 2 and above, supported in vSphere, but this will make your snapshots quiesce your applications. And there's a few registry settings that I'd like to mention that are important for your management. And the first one is the SCSI disk timeout value. By default in Windows, the SCSI disk timeout value is 10 seconds. When you install VMware tools, it actually ups that value to 60 seconds. And what this value is it's the amount of time that Windows will try to access a disk before it deems it not available. And if your C drive is deemed not available, that means that you just blue screened your operating system. And where this can really save your butt is if you have a cluster failover or some kind of fiber channel failover, that nature, sometimes those processes can take longer than 60 seconds. So in my previous engagement, one of my previous engagements, we were failing over a NetApp, and the NetApp time was exactly 63 seconds. So if I didn't set this value, and I didn't before that, it actually crashed a few of the VMs that were trying to do active I/O. So just by bumping this value a little bit, you can give yourself a little more headroom. Another thing is, if you are using WSUS for patching, and you define WSUS inside your templates, that even after you sysprep, so you deploy a VM from that template, even after you sysprep, your WSUS client ID is not reset. And what you'll end up with is a lot less computer names in your WSUS GUI because they're all using the same client ID. So one of the things that I do is I'll go ahead and reset the client ID with a batch script, and I put that in the custom specifications. Excuse me. So example templates, this is our stock Linux template, just has 128 meg root or boot volume, 2 gig swap, and 10 gig disk. So again, you can hot extend these, so don't get caught up on that's not enough space. As long as you have enough to get the operating system running, then you can always extend it. The same in Linux. So Windows, 20 gig is really the standard now. You can't really get smaller than that, 2008. 3 gig page disk, and then 10 gig data disk. Again, this is just a start. I don't want to have huge disks to begin with because it takes me 60 seconds to make the thing bigger. So, it's easy to grow. It's harder to shrink. And I had somebody come up to me after the last and say, well, I can storage vMotion. Storage vMotion does not shrink your volumes, right? You could do a P2V or a V2V, but that's another down process, and something else you have to deal with. So some P2V tips. I don't use the cold boot CD that much, and somebody again was saying, why don't you like the cold boot CD? And it's more of a features thing. The cold boot CD doesn't have as many features as the other converter options. And so I like to use the standalone converter. It's my fave, and the brand new version just came out last week. So if possible, you always want, again, this notion of being able to have flexibility, you always want to make your partitions disks. So in the old model, again, with the RAID controller and the one partition, what you can do with vConverter or the conversion tools is you can actually make those partitions their own individual disks, and then you'll gain flexibility with these P2V VMs. You want to make sure to disable the monitoring services. So if you have HP OpenView, OpenView, HP Sim, Dell OpenManage, or whatever those tools are, what I've seen happen is once you perform the P2V process, if you leave those to start up automatically, when they start up, they can't find any of their hardware because they're no longer running on HP hardware, and your CPU spikes to 100%, and you can't do anything. So you want to make sure to either disable those services before you start the P2V process, or in the wizard, you can also set in the wizard to mark those services as disabled, and then you won't have the P2V issues. So HP Sim agents, Dell, whatever your vendor is. And then also you want to make sure to record IP information. Because you're changing the NIC, you're actually going to lose all of that, which if you've done P2Vs in the past, you're very aware of this fact. So a few more tips. LUN align your disks if possible. So vOptimizer and PlateSpin have this option that you can LUN align during the process because your stuff that was running on physical boxes will not be LUN aligned most likely. You want to remove extra hardware. When you bring these servers over, you're going to see extra USB adapters, serial adapters, all this stuff in your VM that you can get rid of. And there's also going to be a lot of hidden hardware, and I'll get into that in just a second. You want to verify the CPU, network, and everything else because it's going to be based on the original. If you didn't set it, just something to go back and check. It's going to be based on the original hardware. You want to make sure to power on and remove all those services. So if you have the HP array configuration utility and all the other SIM agents, go ahead and you want to uninstall that. You don't want that stuff just laying around. Management agents, old drivers. And then this is kind of wrapping that up into one idea, and that is I see P2V as a gap solution, right? You really need to get off these old physical boxes because you're paying lots of maintenance on them. But ideally, what you'd like to do is build a VM from scratch because your clean VM is going to use a lot less space and it's going to run more efficiently than VMs that you've P2V'd over. So it's kind of a gap solution. If you can build it new, please try that. So hidden hardware. There's lots of hidden hardware, especially after a P2V. You'll see things like local area connection 2, 3, even though you only have one NIC. And so here's some of the commands that you need to run in order to show that hidden hardware. So a lot of people think is if I just right-click on computer, go to manage, go to view, and show hidden hardware, I'm going to see all my hidden hardware. But that's not the case. You actually have to run this set device manager, show non-present devices to actually see this stuff. And then you have to start device manager from that command prompt and then go in there and remove it. What you're going to see is all your old hard disks, all your old CPUs, all your old SCSI stuff. And this will actually have a tangible effect because when the VM is starting up, it's actually trying to find all this hardware that no longer exists. So I've actually seen this speed up boot times. And you want to go ahead and uninstall that hidden hardware. Somebody said that the new version of the converter, which just came out, actually doesn't bring over all this extra stuff. So I haven't tested it yet, but that'd be good to know. So we've we've got all these VMs running. Now we got to manage it. So what we're going to do is, we really have to know our tools and make sure that we have all of our monitoring and things in place. So what are some of the strategies that we can use to manage this beast? From a security standpoint, we want to make sure to use custom roles. We want to limit admin privileges to only the function that they need to perform. And we want to use folders to do role-based authentication control. So have that in your design. Try to develop processes. I really talk to a lot of C-level IT managers, and I tell them, you're not operationally efficient because you don't have processes, you don't have a policy, right? I don't want to get into an argument every time a VM requests a server, an administrator requests a server because he wants 4 CPUs and 32 gigs of RAM, right? If we have a policy in place, then that's a moot point. I can just deploy the VM, and then we can adjust it from there. So try to have processes. So you want to have a trackable VM request. So there's an audit. Who made this request? Why did they make it? It's been approved by a manager. I don't have to justify why these things are running. Make sure to review your snapshots. These are what can bite you. Because if you leave snapshots running out there, they could fill up your storage. So you want to make sure to keep your snapshots not out there very long. You're going to manage them. Get rid of them as soon as you can. They're really useful for performing upgrades, but it's not a backup. And then you want to automate alerts and reporting as much as possible. And that can be done with scripts. So you probably have seen the Power CLIs for administrators by Alan and Luke. They have some great scripts out there. You just download them, make some changes, schedule it. You got to report in your mailbox every Monday morning. So use these tools, automate your tasks, schedule and run those reports. Whenever I talk to a storage vendor, I tell them, this is what I want to know. I want to know what my response time is on my storage and how many IOPS. Response time is all your users care about, as long as it's under 20 milliseconds or so, depending on the application. That's the only thing that matters. And then the IOPS is for capacity planning. I want that report in my mailbox on Monday morning. And thank you, have a nice day. I'll talk to you when I need to buy more stuff. So, we kind of want to get to that model where we're getting stuff delivered to us. We're not going to look for problems. The problems are presenting. They're not problems. The reports are presenting to ourselves so that they don't become a problem. And then a lot of places don't have documentation. So one of the fatal mistakes people make is, oh, yeah, I went out and deployed all my ESX hosts, and then now I got to try to document it. But all my VSX hosts are deployed, and I never went through the process to figure out what I was doing when I did it. So make sure to try to document as you go. Document your templates design as you're building it. Document all the things that you do post-template tasks. Try to do that as you're developing it. So now I'm going to mention a few scripts, and I'm going to show these. These are kind of old, but it's just to show you some of the power that you get with some of these scripts. So this is an older one, but it just shows you in this very small environment, I've got 4 hosts. It tells you what version and build they're running, what vCenter version is, some cluster information. What snapshots do I have? How old are they? How much space are they taking up? Do I have any floppy or CD-ROM drives connected? What's the space on my data stores? How much percent free space do I have? What kind of resources have I allocated to my VM? This report comes to me every morning. I don't have to do any work, right? So this is great. So if my manager wants, to know some information, I'm going to say, here's an email. Go ahead and read it yourself. It's all right there, and I don't have to do any work. So that's something that you're going to see. Like I said, definitely watch that session from Alan and Luke, because they're going to have even more scripts than this. So the ones that I typically run are kind of a health check script that's going to give me some health information, and then also data stores, because I really don't want to run out of space on anything. And then you can automate tasks. So right now, today, kind of the simple way to do that is with Windows Scheduler. But the new groovy and hip way to do this is going to be with Orchestrator. Anybody do the Orchestrator lab down there? That thing is brutal, isn't it? So it's not that easy to use right now, but doing the workflows and having that stuff automated, that's the future. You're going to have a tool to do that, so hopefully they make it a little more user-friendly for us. And then this is my favorite tool of all time. There was a session here called Top 10 Free Tools. And this one's called RV Tools. It's by Rob.net. And Rob's a cool guy. A couple years ago, I actually emailed him and said, hey, we use custom attributes a lot. Can you incorporate that into your tool so that I can just export to Excel, and then I have a poor man's report on who's running what? He's like, no problem. Within a few weeks, he added that to it. So what you can see is some of the information that I put in my custom attribute fields will also be in this report. So anything about the department or bureau, do I manage patching? What's the cost center? Who's on the distribution list? This is only a small portion you can see, of the total report. You just do file, export, and now you have it in an Excel document. So this is a great tool for reporting. So some of the key points: have a detailed design plan before you start. Storage is absolutely critical. Make sure that you get that right. Make sure you put a lot of planning and thought into that. Use vCenter features to help you perfect your templates. Spend a lot of time on that. Make sure you get those things right, and then use scripts to monitor and save time. Well, the last final thoughts I want to make is, so last year I said we need to build synergy between the teams because VMware administration involves networking, it involves security, it involves Windows, Linux, right? We can't be experts in all these areas. So try to build synergy between your teams. And I thought, well, that's too hard to do. So what you need to do is you need to find a buddy. Find a buddy that's on the network team. Find a buddy that's on the security team. Make friends with them. Go over your designs and make sure that you're doing everything right. And then finally, virtualization is a paradigm shift. You can use the old models that we've traditionally used, but if you're going to get the most out of virtualization, you need to figure out that you have a lot more flexibility. You have a lot more things that you can do. You can do it a lot easier. It's more centralized. So realize, embrace, and understand it. And that's my presentation for today. Thank you for coming. I do have a wiki that some of this stuff will be on. It's wiki.averagevmadmin.com. And like I said, download the slides, and there's lots of stuff in the notes section. And then we'll have some time for Q&A. So thank you.